We are all worthy, strong, and committed, and we are ready to go beyond our own limitations. Welcome back, my friends and loved ones, to the Rebel Minded Podcast. I'm your host, Zach, with my co-host, Thor, of course, and I'm here as a friend, a creator, a powerlifter, and a provocateur. And we are here to learn to question the one thing that keeps us from our best, ourselves. Join me as we dive deep to question and strengthen our communication and our vulnerability, create a healthier mind to commit to our goals, and how to give more to our lovers and the world. We're going to face the uncomfortable truths of what it means to be authentically and uniquely flawed, but awesome humans. So, let's get rebel-minded. Also, I'll bring in stories of all things powerlifting, Thor shenanigans, and probably some embarrassing mishaps. Let's do this. Welcome back, my rebel-minded freaks. How are you guys doing? We are back with another guest episode with one of my favorite people I've ever had the privilege of talking to. She's so chipper, so bubbly, and she is a bloody amazing human. Now, Cat is a development worker and coach based over in the UK. She has spent most of her professional life working in human development, and she knows it's not always as glamorous as people might think. She's been up at 5 a.m. hauling cabbages into her truck in Zambia, counting insects in the spiny forest over in Madagascar, and managing programs to deliver HIV prevention to teenagers in rural Tanzania. And most recently, working behind her UK desk to lead on human rights programming in the Middle East and North Africa. Kat knows that humans working on big social problems like health, social care, and education can weigh very heavy, and she sees that working within those fields can take an immensely emotional toll. She also knows what burnout looks like and feels like, as she's intimately felt it herself. She coaches those in those aforementioned helping professions to help them recalibrate and put their needs first. She uses the power of small change to support and motivate clients to identify and achieve their goals. She is a lover of gardening and is a firm believer in the power of the green space. Check her out on Instagram at The Little Green Guru and her website www.catalystcat.co.uk. Now to the episode with Cat Simmons. So, Cat, I've been super excited to do this talk with you. I really like the angle that you come from, because there's so much that there's so many people that lie within different realms that still have the same difficulties with things, right? And your expertise is around the people that are also helping other people, almost in a way that they're so selfless that they don't pay attention to their own needs. I think that was the biggest thing that we were talking about before, right?
Yeah.
So tell everybody your story. Where did everything start?
I am British. You may have guessed by the accent. So I guess I am what you would call, in my day job, sort of a development worker or a charity worker or an international development worker. But really, I use my project management skills, having studied international development at university, to work within the nonprofit sector to deliver programs, projects. I'm currently based in the UK and have been for the last 10 years. But before that, I had the opportunity to live and work in different African countries. So I did a year on Reunion Island, which is in the Indian Ocean, at university, which was amazing. I went to Madagascar. I wrote my master's thesis on Madagascar, not like Madagascar, the film.
Dang it.
There were definitely lemurs. Madagascar, the country, because it is just one of the most amazing biodiverse countries, and my master's degree was in environmental policy and development. So I was very interested in how, in this complex world, do we balance the needs of humans against the needs of the natural world.
Okay.
So in Madagascar, sort of like 90% of plants aren't found anywhere else in the world. 80% of animals aren't found anywhere else in the world. It is just such an amazing country.
Wow.
Yeah, it's absolutely incredible. And that's where you get the lemurs from, because they developed from so I'm going down like a David Attenborough route, but the nature of Madagascar as this big island is that, when it's sort of separated from the mainland, it developed its own special, unique way. But it has its challenges. It's not a very wealthy country. And I was just interested to learn, what do you prioritize, the environment or people's health and well-being. So I went through that, and then I had the honor to work in Rwanda for a couple of years as well, as possibly one of the world's most unprepared teachers, which was quite interesting. And I moved on to working in Zambia, and then in Northern Ireland, Tanzania, and then finally back to the UK. And that was all about really working on development projects on the ground, looking at health, reduction of poverty, community development, each with a slightly different angle and focus, but really kind of what we say in the field, on the ground, living as part of the community, and trying to use my skills and knowledge to contribute something positive. Mm-hmm. And then for the last 10 years, I've been back in the UK, still working for a charity that focuses on HIV and human rights, but very much behind the desk now, trying to deliver programs and projects. And then most recently working in sort of a subsection around risk management. Okay. So exciting.
So exciting.
Yes. And of course, I work as a coach, which is kind of an offshoot of some of the skills and experience that I developed working with people, because basically projects are people. You cannot work within people's communities to make change without developing good people skills. So I've sort of translated that into working as a coach for people mainly who spend a lot of time helping other people.
Mm-hmm. So there's so much time there, Cat. And no, seriously, like, and
I'm really old. Like,
no,
wow.
no, more like, I mean, because my last decade is not as colorful for sure. As far as working with other people, at least. And it's so intriguing. And I guess it would, very curiosity striking to know how much you learned about people, because you learned so much, like that's what your work was, right?
Yeah.
And how that affects how you do things today. I mean, it's all a lot of the similar stuff, right? So I guess what was the biggest thing that you were learning or did learn through like over a decade's worth of time about people, and how does that connect to what you're doing now and the people that you're serving now?
Good question. I think really I learned so much about myself and my own culture, because people always think, oh, well, if you go and work in Rwanda, you'll learn a lot about Rwandese culture. And of course you will. And, I tried to learn a bit of the language, and we were very much based within the community. So had to, go to the market every day, get on the bus with my fellow teachers and go up to school, et cetera, et cetera. But really, I learned so much more about what it means to be me in my identity as a white British cis woman. Mm-hmm. And that was always such a shock that, in a strange way, sometimes the effect of going back to your home country is stronger than the sort of like discombobulation you get when you first move somewhere overseas, because you're moving overseas because you want to. So there's obviously something in your mind that is open to these new experiences. So working within very sort of like diverse environments with people from all different backgrounds, speaking different languages, having to learn how to interpret, kind of how people live their lives, it makes you able to reflect on your own way of doing stuff, but also to appreciate that actually, wow, these things are so culturally ingrained into my being that I never realized. So like, for example, in the UK, if you go to someone's house and the person invites you in, if you are planning on staying any considerable amount of time, normally you take your coat off. And of course, the exception of that is if you're just popping by literally to give somebody something. And then when it's time for you to leave, normally in a British household, you pick up your coat, and that's the signal, the cultural signal that I'm going to make a move. Or somebody, if they want to get you out the house, they might say something like, oh, shall I get your coat? As a little bit of a sort of coded way of saying, right, thank you, I need to get on with my life. and I didn't realize when I went to Rwanda that in Rwanda, and I am obviously basing this entirely on my one experience, but it's not so common that you would take your coat off at somebody's house necessarily. And it led to a really interesting time at my house when we had some Rwandese colleagues come around, and they came in and they sat down and we were having a chat. And because they had their coats on, I kind of felt like, oh, this is just going to be a quick visit. They were there for like a really long time. And then it got to the point where it's like, oh, it's actually starting to get a bit dark now. Like, you know, and sort of try all the sort of British cultural signals like, oh, well, looking at the watch, better get a move. But of course, couldn't say, oh, shall I get your coat? Because they were still wearing their coats. And I found out afterwards that they have been incredibly uncomfortable, because it would have been more appropriate for me to stand up and say, thank you for coming to visit. It's time for you to leave now, and to physically walk with them off the property.
Wow.
So they had been sitting there waiting for me to liberate them from this visit. And I had been sitting there waiting for them to volunteer to get up and go so that I could be liberated from the visit. And it's a silly example, but it just goes to show how you can learn so much about your own cultural upbringing. And I've had such, you know, pleasure and opportunity to continue to work within a diverse workspace in my UK job. And I guess it's hard to remember, but it's just trying to remember that you come with your own biases and your own perceptions. So even when you're working as a coach, it's really important to try and remember that your reaction to a situation or your feelings about a situation may not be the same depending on the person's own experience, their cultural background, the way that they've been brought up, for example. And that can really come into play when we have, you know, big events in life. You know, one of the examples is, you know, sometimes people pass away in the family, and the automatic reaction is to assume that somebody is going to be very, very sad and to be very visibly sad about that. And in some cultures, it's not appropriate. You know, grief is not shown in the same way. And also on a human level, we can never assume that somebody is necessarily going to be feeling the way that we feel. So it's really important to try. And it's, you know, it's like a life lesson to try and just remember that actually the way that the person is expressing themselves doesn't necessarily mean what you think it means.
Yeah. I think when we're unable to get outside of our own world, it leads us to not only a lot of assumption, I guess, but it gives a direction to us of how we think things are supposed to work.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And there was this study that was done, I don't know how many years ago. I vaguely remember reading about it. And they did this study with these tribesmen in the jungle that were, you know, they're almost completely undisturbed. Right. And they did this test of expressions with them. And a typical culture of, you know, what an expression looks like with surprise, what fear looks like, what all these different emotions look like. And they showed them to these tribal people, and they were almost, none of them were like a match of what we would have expected. You know, their expression of fear was not the same as ours. Their expression of affection and their expression of anger was not the same as ours, which is really mind-blowing when you think about it, because everyone seems to think that they know exactly how other persons are, when maybe it's a lot more cultural, or maybe it's a lot more hidden than we realize, and we're faking it anyway, right? For the idea of not having to get uncomfortable, maybe. You know?
It's such a good point. And, I do believe, we are one sort of like species in the sense that we're so diverse, but we do have these common, values and needs and ways of connecting as human social creatures that is really important. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, how people visibly express how they feel can be so different depending on where you are in the world. Your gender, your sexual orientation, how you identify in the space, it can really impact stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's so every day was a learning day for me, every day, and I learned so much about what it means to be British.
More than you probably realized you did.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I think it took me a little while to not be on attack, because it's the culture that I was raised in, but being so mad about the American things, but I think that's the point of discovery. Like you find surprise, you find anger, you find frustration, or you find maybe even glee, I guess, in the way that you were raised without even realizing that's how you were raised.
Definitely.
So did this kind of stuff help you in the work that you do today? Because the biggest thing that you and I were talking about, which was a big point of view for you, which I mean, it was something you really want to put emphasis on, was helping all these people that were far too much helping others rather than helping themselves.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, the development sector, it's a specific career path. It has lots of different sort of avenues. But it's a thing, and lots of people feel very called to use their skills, in a way that benefits the wider society. And there's been lots of critiques of the international aid sector and the need to decolonize aid, and it is complex, but at the heart of it there is, for most of the time, a desire from somebody to want to usually alleviate or to help alleviate the suffering of others. And that's a very noble cause, and it comes, with its pros and cons. And, not everybody who works in development are angels, as we know. But I feel that most of the people that I've hung out with and worked with, we've had this shared vision of, it's like, well, the world doesn't have to be like this, and if we could do things in a slightly different way, wouldn't it be better for everybody? But it has its drawbacks in the sense that it's a very intense job most of the time. On a personal level, it can be really difficult. Often my experiences in the sort of development side of things, obviously in terms of the humanitarian response within conflict zones or to disasters, that's a whole different kettle of fish. And that's even more intense than, what some people would experience living and working overseas. And it can depend so much who you're working with, who you're working for. Are you working for a super large organization? Are you working for the UN? Are you working for a small charity? But at the core, there is this desire to do something of good. But it can become all encompassing, and you find that the lines can start to blur between your own identity outside of your job, because so many decisions are made in life based on the job. And take that along with your sort of personal sense of mission and values, and suddenly it's like, I am only here because of my job. I am only in Tanzania because of the work. I'm only in rural Zambia because of the job. So that can be quite hard. Obviously, you leave your friends, your family, sometimes your partners. You have to try and rebuild constantly these social networks. It can be really difficult, and it can lead to, unfortunately, overwork. Working on these big social problems, there is no end date to these issues. Yeah. They are complex and they take time. Things like behavior change. We know it, in our own experiences, how difficult it is to change our behavior. Oh, I wish that I didn't drink so much wine at the weekend. I wish that I ate more healthily. It's so hard then to make those changes. So, in that sort of context, these big social problems where maybe you feel very strongly about the injustice in the world, or you feel very morally, strong in the sense that it's just not acceptable. for so many millions of people to be living in abject poverty, often because of, the nation from where you've come yourself, talking about that whole decolonizing aid piece. And just the sense that, kids shouldn't go to bed hungry. And that is something that, it's not just a problem out there. These are issues that we face in our own societies, of course, in our own cultures. So it's not so simple just to say, oh, I'm going there and nothing like this exists in my own community. But it can be really challenging. Sometimes there's, vicarious trauma. You can sometimes see things that are upsetting or difficult to deal with. And those things stay with you for a long time. And, it really is around that sort of loss of identity and being able to come back to that place where it's like, what I would like to do in my life, can I do it without feeling guilty? It's that sense of everybody else has it worse than me. So why am I complaining? And it's true, we have this society where, people can be too selfish. People can be very ignorant of the wider world. They can be very narrow-minded and focused on then, what they want. But it's when it starts to swing too far the other way, and then you start to realize that you're being perhaps too much driven by this external focus rather than your sort of internal true self, that's when you realize, actually, wow, this job has taken over my life. And it's led me to places where I'm not quite sure I like this person anymore. So it's tricky.
I mean, the thing that comes to mind most, I guess, is like, if you, regardless of whatever job you have, because I think it's a constant learning process. And I think that, different stages and different examples and different experiences like a matter, like diversity of experience really matters. But it seems like no matter what you do, even if you want to do something noble, if you're not careful, you'll lose your autonomy. You can almost still be have like a victim mindset, because you're so obligated to do everything for everybody else that you don't see where you have power to do things for yourself, maybe. You know what I mean? I don't know. It's kind of a tricky spot, because you would think that the work that you're doing is so progressive and so effective for everybody outside of you that it would bring instant happiness, to yourself, right? Because there's that phrase of like, do everything, give value to the world, and the world will give back what you need. But it does seem like it can be very taxing emotionally, physically, even maybe spiritually too. What are the types of jobs of the people that you're working with that are having the biggest difficulty with this type of thing?
Yeah. I mean, before I answer that, just to sort of reflect on the point you've raised there, I mean,
totally.
You got to remember these things in life. Everything has a payoff, doesn't it? There's a reason why we keep doing these things. And you might ask the question, like, why do people do this job then if it's like so detrimental to their sense of identity? And it's like, but you have to remember, when you're working with your colleagues in those kind of environments, people that work in international development, like I said, they're very motivated, they're very inspired and inspiring. There is a real energy that you get from hanging out with people who have this sense of being moved to action, who are just not prepared to accept the status quo. And you really do feel very much like in the present moment and alive. And there is something quite, attractive about that. It feels great. You feel like, I'm not worried about the small shit in life, because how could I be when this is the community that I'm living in and this is the challenges that people are facing, and I feel like I'm actually part of that. I mean, it's massively, massively rewarding, but it's that sense of balance, that real sense of balance. And I think that, to be very clear, it's not just people who work in international aid. I see the same thing, for anybody who works on what I call the big social problems. So health professionals, nurses, doctors, healthcare assistants, can I even include dentists, teachers, social workers, people that work on, drug and alcohol rehabilitation. These are all jobs where people give so much of their energy to a problem that has no defined end, and where often there is both pain and pleasure in working with people who are experiencing pain, but also who have great fulfilled lives as well. Because, let's face it, not everybody's a victim. We don't want that savior approach. That's not helpful. But it's very difficult when think about the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, the impact it's had on healthcare professionals the whole of the last year, and it will continue. Imagine that you've been working in a hospital and you're working with COVID patients. Do you think you're really going to care that you couldn't get feta cheese for your dinner?
Yeah.
Any cheese will do. I'm just happy I've got a dinner break. It's that kind of attitude. So it's really, really tough for people, where you're having to think constantly about how all these different connections are made. Wow, the outcome that we want is this. How do we get there? And that sounds really easy when you're dealing with things like building bridges. Practical things. But, how do you reduce stigma for people living with HIV, for example?
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. So it's almost like losing your identity to something. Even if it is noble, does that kind of seem on track, I guess? People losing themselves so much to their work that they don't forget who they are. Because what it reminds me of is like moms that that are no longer moms, or moms that parents that get divorced or whatever, and then she has to find her own way, and she doesn't have her kids with her all the time, or there's a bunch of different situations, and I don't want anybody to start attacking like, oh well, yeah, anyway. So or like moms, or I have two friends that are cops, and one of the biggest things, because I went through the process too of becoming a deputy, and the thing that they really instilled in us, or tried to really instill in us, is like, make sure that you have a life outside of this, because you put in a lot of hours here, and you get to know the people here a lot, and you and these other people are the only ones that really understand what you're doing and why you do it, and that perspective. So you'll become so attached to the work, and you'll only hang out with other deputies and other law enforcement people, and then you won't know what to do and how to look at people outside of that work and outside of that perspective. And they said it gets really unhealthy.
Yeah, that's exactly it, Zach. That's it. It's spot on. How can you talk to your friends back home in the UK about the things that you've seen living in Tanzania or Rwanda? How can you, when they're worried about like, oh, is my freezer delivery going to arrive on time? And I slid very much back to that perspective. I remember coming back to the UK in 2007, and I walked into a department store, and I saw a child's dress. I think it was a Christian Dior dress or a Gucci dress for a child, like a baby. Oof. And it was like £200. And it provoked such a feeling in me that I actually said something to the assistant, like, this is disgusting.
Oh,
yeah. But you know what? We're not all angels. Yeah. I won't lie to you. I have spent £70 on a candle. So it's easy. It was a very nice candle. But you can see how easy you can slip back. And that's why I think so many people find it so hard to have that balanced life, because it's almost easier just to stay in it. Like you say, socialize with your work colleagues, see them in the office or the hospital or the department or whatever, hang out with them socially, that kind of stuff. It's tough.
So how do you help people find that balance if there's such an extreme that we put ourselves into our work and everything? How do you help people step back into doing the little things for themselves and enjoying who they are and their hobbies and their interests? What brings people back into that balance?
Definitely. I mean, for me, it really is that sense of, what I call that recalibration approach, because, it can be really overwhelming And ironically, a lot of people that work to help others, they're very intelligent people, and because you're working with these big problems, I usually find that most of them are quite sort of, very good thinkers, and they can understand things very logically, but we find it very hard to apply it to ourselves. So, we know that it takes time to change people's behavior. We know that it takes time to see big shifts. And I think sometimes we sort of go, oh yeah, but for us, I just won't bother doing that, or like, it's too difficult. And we get very much a sense of overwhelm. And that is often because there's still a lot of energy being drawn into the preliminary identity, whether it's your, in this case, mostly your work or your profession. So it really is to start, couching it in terms of, if you can make massive shifts, go for it. That's fine. But guess what? You can make small, consistent changes in the way that you live, and you will see the benefits of doing that. And the other side of the coin is to say, and you deserve that. You deserve that. You are not betraying your sense of duty to the bigger world by wanting to put in boundaries or to use different sort of self-care methods. So it really is recalibration, like, let's do it one thing at a time, small steps at a time. It's self-compassion to say, I'm not betraying my moral feelings about, what's good for me. Again, that whole sort of, why am I complaining? I have electricity. It's the self-care, which is, how can I actually start to connect more deeply to what I need on all the different levels, physical, spiritual, whatever. And I think it is about looking at the person holistically. So often I might have a client who will come and say, oh, I've got an issue with my job. I'm not sure if I want to, how I want to move next in the sector, et cetera, et cetera. But it's never really just about the job, because when you start to talk to them, you realize, hey, guess what? They're a whole person under this job identity. And if you don't treat the whole person in the sense of, you not treat in the medical sense, but treat as in paying attention to the different elements of the person, then it totally undermines the entire point, which is to move forward in a way that you feel whole, if that makes sense.
No, totally. Yeah. I think that whole is something that people desire, and a lot of times I think it's they feel like it's farther away than it really is. It seems like most times we have what we really need. It's what creates the shortcoming, I think, is realizing that it's within our action, it's within our pauses, it's within our presence, in order to recognize that we have everything we need, and we have everything we need to move forward too. It's the action and educating ourselves, or taking our moments that separate us from the world or whatever. Have you noticed a continuous pattern in certain people? Does it come down to certain emotions or certain perspectives that people are particularly in? Because I'm wondering if there's people on the other side of the mic that want some sort of relativity, that want to be able to hear, oh, okay, well, I also feel this. Maybe it's possible for me to feel whole by myself. Have you noticed a lot of patterns in people?
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. I think really underlying the sort of things that I tend to encounter, you can see it in other parts of society. So it's definitely not a challenge that's just solely linked to this sector of the community. You mentioned mums and parents. I would say, it really is that on one side, it's the kind of the sort of slightly guilty feelings. I've made a commitment to this cause. I've made a commitment to this organization. If I want to do something that suits me better, and shock horror, if it's outside of the sector, that's even like doubly worse. So it's that feeling of responsibility is often very high, which again, I think you see in parents. Their sense of responsibility, or guardians, the sense of responsibility towards the people that they're looking after, takes precedence over everything. And sometimes it doesn't stop even when the circumstance changes. We always joke about, martyr mums who just never put themselves first.
Yes.
Not easy, but it's that kind of thing. And also, one thing I notice is that people who work in these kind of sectors, and you probably include parents in this, they're really tired because they work like long hours, or they feel the sort of like the mental strain of the work. I mean, number of cases of burnout, rust out, really poor boundaries. So emails all the time, emails in the evening, emails at the weekend. I've seen emails from people being sent, and I'm thinking, when did this email get sent? And I look, and it was sent at 5:29 on a Saturday morning.
Oh,
no, come on.
Yeah.
It's those feelings spill over into the behavior. So the emotion need for that kind of poor boundaries is definitely something that's common. And remember, sometimes people may not even be aware of it.
Yeah.
They may not even see it as a problem. They might say, oh, well, it's bloody efficient for me to be sending emails all weekend, or that's when it suits me to send an email. What's the problem?
Yeah.
But
Thor's dreaming right now.
Oh, bless.
No, I think that's so huge too, is what we don't see about ourselves. And that's why I think this has been one of the hardest things for me too, is not only making sure that we interact with other people, not, making sure that we not just communicate, but communicate about the things that are tough, the things that are disturbing us, because I think that we put on this shield of like, I'm doing good, like I've got this education and I'm making a difference. And then we don't think we're good enough, or that we should be able to handle ourselves complete, like we're supposed to be an emotional Superman inside, but we're so based around, doing things together. It's why part of the reason we're the dominant species, I think, is because we collaborate, and I think people are so afraid to do that they don't have that outside perspective that will, this genius that we would think that would help them, when really it's just a different angle that someone else has for us. That's why I think that therapists and counselors and coaches are so crazy important right now, because everybody's so out of focus, and so everybody's so out of touch with their inner selves that we need people to really help us see what's true about us, because I think who we are is so separated from the actual reality of what we're doing. For the longest time, it's something I've been trying to attack, and I probably need a good coach, Kat. We'll need to talk after this. Is that I feel like I'm not worth anything if I don't do my work, if I don't work. But I also only know that work as the physical labor that I've always done my whole life, probably because that's how my father has done it. That's the only work he's ever known, is physical labor. And so when I start tapping into something that I think is good for other people, that I think is creative, that I think is beneficial and valuable, I don't see that as work. And so I attack myself, saying this is not priority, because nobody's going to believe that you're worthy if you're not doing something that is, keeping you above ground, that is paying your bills, that is beneficial to everybody else. And not allowing myself to find benefit in the work that I do outside of my day job. And so you destroy yourself a little bit.
I would like to just say, you might consider humans to be the dominant species, but I would argue that if you had spent a similar night in the rather divey hotel in which I used to stay in Tanzania with all of the mosquitoes in Dar es Salaam, you might feel very not dominant in that sort of situation. I certainly didn't feel in control of anything. No, you're absolutely right. And I think it goes back to that sense of, the internal focus versus the external, what is driving you. And I know through my sort of experience of, sort of going down the counseling training pathway, and also being, a counseling client myself, it's like, that's the hardest thing. It's like where we feel very driven by the external factors. We don't make decisions that really reflect deeply, what we need and we want. And when you on a logical level feel that your work is very beneficial to the external environment, that's the point. What if you change your mind? What if you don't want to keep doing that, or you want to do something different? And I don't think it's about manual or non-manual work, or academic work or non-academic work, but it's about what's driving you and where are you coming from. And if you're able to say, what is really my purpose here? Am I really doing this for the community, or am I doing it for me? And what's the, if I'm saying yes to this, what am I saying no to? That's always a good question. And like you say, because people are not, we're not logical. That's part of the problem, and we are never just our jobs. So your feelings about, like you said, about the need for the financial security, that comes from our own experience and what we've experienced growing up and how we see it reflected in the world around us. And wouldn't it be interesting if I took you to where I used to live in Zambia, for example? I wonder how that might shift your mindset, and maybe you wouldn't feel so strongly, because out of your cultural reference, it doesn't have the same weight.
Totally.
And that's what's so fantastic about being able to experience living in different countries and cultures, is that, like I said right at the beginning, you reflect so much back on your own cultural upbringing, and it can be so liberating, because you suddenly realize, in this culture, people don't think that way about me, so therefore I don't have to be like this or like that. It can be very, very liberating.
Gonna make me cry. I think it's majorly important that people can see outside of their own view, and I think everybody does want to be liberated somehow. I think a lot of times, like, we're suffering in a way that we don't want to express because we feel ashamed of it, or because we feel embarrassed about it. We think that in the world of today, where everybody is capable of putting their best front forward, and then that's the one dimension that you see as a human, you think that that's also what you're supposed to be. Right. So apart from everybody traveling and making sure they get a different cultural, because I think a lot of us would love that, right?
Yep. Ironically,
right? How would people define, I mean, I guess it would be uniquely to everybody, defining self-care is what I'm getting at. How can we put in that self-care? How can each person do something, or how do we describe self-care in a way that people can do this daily and can separate themselves from their work, or the value that they're giving, to make themselves feel more whole? Like, what are the kind of steps that we can do to really attack that and feel like we're, oh man, part of something good, but we also love ourselves?
Yes, exactly. Very good question. So it's very interesting. I think the whole sort of like self-care discourse, I think we have to recognize right from the beginning that we all come from a position of our own relative privilege.
Okay.
So that's what you learn, obviously, being a global citizen. And that's why it's so good to be able to get out into the world or to meet with different people, is that it helps you to understand, like I said, your own cultural space. But also, we have to acknowledge that there is inherent privilege in many of the positions that we hold, based on where we are, who we are, our gender, our sexual orientation, what we do, etc., the opportunities we've had in life. So I sometimes get a bit cross when it can be very flippant to say, oh, self-care, it's not just about bubble baths, actually self-care is about doing like really hard work. And it's like, yes, of course, self-care isn't just about bubble baths or meditation or massages, but that comes for me from a place of privilege. Imagine you don't have hot running water at home, and you're living with 14 people in a very small space with no electricity. I can honestly say to you, from my own position of privilege, I feel that it would be more likely than less likely that somebody might feel that for them, in that circumstance, a bubble bath is flipping amazing.
Yeah, right.
thing that they could, you know. So I think we just have to be careful about not being too sniffy about what we think self-care is for everybody else. Because really, the really hard stuff is the hard self-care, which is where you start to reflect on things like your boundaries, how you create space for yourself, how you have difficult conversations, how you can feel comfortable to say no to things, how you value your own time and resources, how you put in steps to be aware of and not take on everybody else's problems, thereby removing their own agency from the situation, that you really reflect on the confusion that we sometimes have about, you know, why am I doing this? Is it for myself or is it, you know, for the wider community? And is there maybe a reason why I'm doing it that benefits me beyond that? And that can be really hard. So for me, that's why so many of us would prefer to have a bubble bath. Much nicer, you know. So I really I really would like to have the conversation with people without too much judgment about what they consider self-care to be, because it will be so different for each person depending on their circumstances. For some people, the best self-care is saying no to a family get-together, where normally the family get-together causes them a lot of stress and heartbreak and frustration and arguing, because guess what? That happens in life. And for somebody, that might be the bravest thing that they can do, is to say the boundary for my own health and well-being is that I say no to this. So again, what you say yes to and what you say no to. It doesn't always have to be something like that, but it's the process of looking into your life and saying, based on what I need and want and the vision of where I want to get to, what can I do along the way to be self-compassionate and to care for myself? And for some adults, it's reparenting themselves. For some adults, it's allowing themselves to spend money because they've come from a place where, you know, spending money is not seen as a positive thing. So you see, it's about that rebalance between what the external world is telling you how to live your life and then what you have, your true self, which, you know, so I see it all leading towards that same sort of idea, you know, that you're better in touch with what you really want and that you can move forward with less judgment, you know.
And be okay with what you want.
Yeah. Because and to express it and to talk about it, you know, without shame or embarrassment. Imagine you'd gone to university and you'd studied a PhD in economics and you went off to work with the UN, you know, I don't know, in Guatemala, working on their, I don't know, multilateral economic development program. And then imagine you got really burnt out after 15 years in the field and you came back home and you lost touch with your friends. You didn't have a partner or any children yourself. You'd never owned a home there. And then imagine you said, oh, sod this for a game of laughs. I want to open a bakery. Do you see what I mean?
Oh, totally. Yeah.
How many people would be like, sorry, you went to university and got a PhD. You've been doing amazing work in Guatemala and now you want to open a bakery. Do you see all the stigma and judgment that's in that? That's why people don't like to move away from what they've already invested in, even if it's not making them happy anymore.
So in that situation, do you think I'm going to question this Cat? This is my job, is to create questions. So do you think that has, I guess, if there's a shame factor, is it like because it's so separated from the work, and because if that were the case and the guy was going to open a bakery, then the questions, maybe, I mean, I know, I guess I'm asking you also. I guess the questions might be like, this is, you know, this isn't saving the world. This isn't helping, you know, this isn't helping people through their problems. It's, you know, if I'm baking food, it's only carbs and I'm only making people's health worse. It's not enough to fill my own heart, even though I feel like baking is one of my favorite things in the world. And you dismantle all the reasons why this would be good for you. Yeah. You know, and you compare it to a past life or a life you're expected to live almost. Right. I mean, it's not my own dream, so it's hard to find the questions, but.
No, or the challenge is, how could you do something that might be perceived as so selfish, knowing what you know, when you've seen people suffering from abject poverty, who are not
Yeah.
able to take agency, who don't necessarily have governments that look out for them. That's the challenge. It's like, how do
Yeah.
you imagine you were a doctor, same sort of thing. You've invested a lot of time and energy. You help. What do doctors do? Doctors help people. It's the entire basis of their being, is they want to do that. Imagine you said, oh yeah, actually I'd love to become an interior designer.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm not saying we can't generalize, but I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people have these thoughts about, as they go through life. It's like, hey, guess what interests me now at 43 is very different from what interested me at 23. But
Yes.
oh shit, I have invested a lot in this pathway, mentally, energetically, practically, financially. And I'm not saying that only people who work in development or doctors have this issue, but I think it's exacerbated by the fact that if you have chosen to get into a profession that is explicitly has the goal to help people, and that's how other people perceive your role, then it can be really hard to say, actually, I want to do something slightly different.
No, yeah, it seems like if you talk to enough people, you have this, you kind of start to get this skill, like this reading of energy that kind of lights you up, or it does for me at least. Like you see something that somebody may not be their job, but they're really good at, and you feel their passion about it, and you're like, in the back of your mind, you're like, why don't you do this for your living? You're like, why don't you just do this? And then there's other people where you can feel the vibe that it's all about the success, and you have no idea who they are inside. And I don't know, there's that weird energy transference that maybe not all people feel, or maybe are not all aware of, but you can really tell the passion in somebody when in those types of situations, and you almost question the other person inside yourself of like, how are you not doing this? Because you seem so vibrant, you seem so alive when you talk about this, or when you act out on this type of thing. And I guess that goes back to them thinking that it's only a hobby, and it's not meant to be the life-sustaining thing that they want. They're too obligated to a job, or you've spent 20 years, like what you're saying, dedicated to a career, and it's the only thing that so how do you separate yourself from that? How do you start over, I guess, quote unquote, start over in something new, even though it's something that you would love to be a part of and something you're super passionate about?
It's so true. And I think and don't get me wrong, there are plenty of people that work in the development sector or the non-profit sector, who are very career focused and driven, and they are financially rewarded for the hard work that they give, and they don't have any of these issues that I'm talking about. So just like any other part of society, there's always some people at one end and others at the other end. But I think it's absolutely true. I've completely forgotten the question now, because I was so in my own brain about thinking about that. Sorry, it's 5 o'clock. It's nearly time for wine. Carry on.
We got to make it to at least 5 so that we can have exactly. The glass of wine. No, obviously we want to wrap this into the rebel-minded process, right? That is the point of the podcast, and the rebel-minded process is all about what we decide to question. So are there things that you think people are not questioning enough, or and what kind of help do they need? I always think that questioning should always include other people as much as it can. Question yourself, question the world, but at some point you have to have that outside perspective. Communicate something that you're questioning yourself to somebody else and see what they think. But I guess from Cat's point of view, from the UK point of view, from the UK culture, especially because of your experience, because you've done so much that is so noble and so dedicated to helping other people. I guess I'm trying to find what's going to help people get out of their rut, their slough of thinking that they're not good enough to take care of themselves. Like, what do we have to question the most in
Yes,
ourselves if we don't have access to all the other things?
it's a very good question. And for me, I think it's the paradox of human life, not to get too philosophical.
Oh, let's totally do. I love it.
We know that in the greater scheme of things, we are but a blip in the universal time frame of existence. We know this. We know that we die, we continue to exist in our current form and physical shape, if you want to allow for lots of other possibilities. But we know this. We know that sometimes really unfortunate things happen and people die way before you would like them to, or people have accidents or stupid things happen. So we know logically that human beings are fragile, and we know that we are also at times violent and complicated and destructive. We also know that we are caring and community minded and, you know, determined to make shifts so that people have a more equal existence in this world, because we can see ourselves in that bigger context. However, knowing all this and knowing, particularly like in our lifetime, think about it, my God, the access to technology, can, you know, holy moly, Google Earth, you know, my God, you know, phones, all this kind of stuff. We have so much more knowledge. Yet we are so stupid sometimes. I think they were saying we know more about the moon than we do about our own oceans. And for me, that's what is always the thing to remember. It's like, we know that we are very small things on this floating ball hurtling through the universe. Yet we sometimes become so detailed focused. I mean, how many times have we done it? Had a difficult email conversation with people at work, or somebody bumped your truck in the parking lot or whatever. That shit stays with us for days.
Yeah.
4 days. And yet we know that we only have this one life. So I really love that visualization where it's like, just think about where you are now. Stop thinking about everything else. And just visualize yourself. See yourself from outside your body. Here I am. This is what I'm wearing. This is where I'm sitting down. And then start to zoom out. Okay, now I'm floating above myself from the second story of my house and I can see the top of my head. Then zoom out. Oh, that's my house. Zoom out further. Oh, that's my town. Zoom out further, 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 further. And just remind yourself right now, somewhere in the world, somebody is having a baby. Somebody is dying. Somebody is opening a bottle of champagne because they got the all clear from their last medical test. Somebody is having lunch with their grandparents. Somebody is mowing the lawn. Somebody is walking 5 miles to get water. Somebody is cowering from gunfire. Somebody is looking at the sunrise over the ocean. Somebody is climbing the side of a volcano. Somebody is making little pancakes and selling them on the street. Yeah. And that's what you've got to say to yourself. Now think about where I am and what am I doing? And is this really what I want to be doing in my life? Really? And it's really, I find it so helpful just to think about that. Just think about that. Because we have, especially when you have that agency and you have that ability to make changes, where you are living in a world that is more secure. And this isn't, again, this is not to take away from people's individual challenges, but we live in an unequal world and some people do have more opportunity than others. So it's just like, and therein lies the paradox, because that is exactly the mindset which then causes us to overwork, over-identify. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. But many people, I think, would benefit from just being able to visualize, wow, out of all the things that are happening to human beings on Earth right now, this is what I'm doing. And am I happy with that?
That's it. It's raw, I guess is the best way to put it. It's like, it's truth. It's truth. And God, what better way to question our existence about things, like our personal, our individual existence? Because out of 8 billion people, how do we place ourselves? If we're a blip in time, we're also kind of a blip on the globe too, and how big of effect do you want to have? How I That's a tough one. That's a tough one. I think that's on an individual basis.
Yeah.
That would be very unique and diverse for a lot of people, though. How better a way to decide that you are something different, that you are something unique, that you can attack to so many different other problems, and you can fulfill yourself in so many other different ways.
And we don't want overwhelm, because that we don't want to stay stuck in this feeling of like, oh my god, I'm just this inconspicuous ant on planet Earth. There's no point. It doesn't matter.
Oh, I totally took that the wrong way.
So that's why doing these kind of exercises is always helpful when you have a coach who can kind of give you a little bit of guidance and, hold that space for you. If you want to think about it on your own time, of course you can. So again, it's about this for me, these are such good questions, because this is the entire problem with the human existence, is that we are very, very complex as a species. We have these complexities, we have these interdependencies, we have this inequality across the world, which makes it really difficult. Some people might say it's really inappropriate just to tell somebody, who's living in poverty, oh, just think about where you are in the globe, so do you see what I mean? It's got to be appropriate for the context that you're in. And it goes right back to that question of, for people who then feel that they don't want other people to experience pain, suffering, whether here in the UK or elsewhere in the world, you can see why it becomes such a strong pull to people, and then why paradoxically it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it becomes very difficult for people to put those boundaries in.
Now I just feel like I gotta sit and think.
Yeah, but sit and think is good, but then we have to move to action. That's the important thing, because ruminating, or we don't want to dwell too much on it, but we want to say, okay, so then realistically, if I reflect on me, what's the vision that I want for my life, for me as a holistic person, not just my job. Okay, right, now what can we do to start getting there? And that's the process of coaching, to bring it right back down to reality, and to say, okay, with the resources that you have, the time that you have, the life that you're living, the classic, you are here, you want to get to here, how can we break it down? And that coaching process can be so helpful, particularly for some of these big questions, because they almost seem insurmountable. It's like, well, where the hell do I start? I'm just a blip in the ocean. What the hell? Oh, I wish I never thought that. So you always want to bring it back down and say, okay, so what can you do? What's the smallest thing you can do?
Well, and there's I very much agree with that. That's one of my, I guess, I don't think I have an official mantra, but that's part of my mantra, is I have to act. I have to act, no matter how small it may seem, because the ruminating, like you're talking about, it keeps us so focused on the problem. If we don't have a healthy state of mind, it's almost always comes back to the way our brain is wired around the things that are negative, the things that hold us back, the things that made us who we are in the first place, and why we feel stuck. So it even goes beyond my own slogan out there of questioning everything. Like you legitimately have to act on things. And that's probably one of the best things about coaching, is that you have somebody to keep you responsible, to to remind you of what you're supposed to be doing, in order to, because if you clear up and find your vision of what you want to be, you have somebody saying, okay, like, I'm going to keep you accountable. I'm going to keep you on track. Because a lot of times we'll sabotage ourselves and not pay attention, just give up on what we've done because we think that we're not possible of doing it.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's the smallest action.
Or we default back into the old mindset, which is, I really want to work on myself because I'm not, fully where I want to be, but the work I'm doing is so important. I have to do that. That has to be the priority. That's a very easy mindset to fall into. where you're just continuing to reinforce that narrative that, doing that sort of saving the world job is somehow more important. It is important, like anyone's job or whatever is important to them is important, but it cannot be at the expense. And I don't know if you've ever read this book by Viktor Frankl.
I've listened to it. I would much rather read it.
Yeah, Man's Search for Meaning. And obviously it's quite an intense book because it talks about his experience during the Holocaust, but he was really one of the first psychologists to develop this theory of what he calls logotherapy. And if you don't mind, I just want to read a little bit from it, because
totally,
it really articulates the complexity of what it means psychologically in that sort of understanding where we fit into the world. And he says, as logotherapy teaches, there are three main avenues on which one arrives at meaning in life. The first is by creating a work or by doing a deed. The second is by experiencing something or encountering someone. In other words, meaning can also be found not only in work, but also in love. But most important, however, is the third avenue to meaning in life. Even the helpless victim of a hopeless situation, facing a fate he cannot change, may rise above himself, may grow beyond himself, and by doing so, change himself. He can change a personal tragedy into a triumph. And this was very much based on his understanding, going through the Holocaust and trying to understand psychologically how that environment affected people psychologically. And it's a fantastic book, and I would really recommend it. It's of course very moving and very intense, but also very thought-provoking. And I think for me, that sort of understanding that the work and the doing is one part, the encountering, the sort of relationship is another, but the third one that he talks about is about your mindset. That's the thing that you can also control and change, and that's what leads you to be able to appreciate meaning in what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you for sharing that, Kat. That is a fantastic passage. I don't. I think they're gonna have to buy that. There's something with reading that slows my mind down. That's why I quit listening to books. I want to read them, even though it's a hobby that I have lost a little track of, to be honest. But I have probably 40 books that I have to read. A couple last questions here, Kat. So sure. When it comes to self-care and this selflessness and finding a balance between the two, what is it that you think is the most influential thing in incorporating that balance, I guess?
I think, of course, it will be different for different people, but from my own experience, the sense of having strong and appropriate boundaries is often the thing that's missing, or it's difficult. And by reinserting stronger boundaries, it helps to retain that sense of identity beyond just what you do as a job or how you spend your time. And it allows you to work in a way that's more positive for yourself. It's not always easy, that's entirely the point. But for me, I think that's definitely something to look at, with clients, for example, what's going on, where are there sort of, gaps in the boundaries, and the client may not recognize that themselves at first, but that's the coaching process, is to it's not for me to say, oh, I think you've got a problem with your boundaries. No, but it's to help support the client to go through that process where they're able to increase their own awareness and go, oh, kind of feels like I have a problem with boundaries. I wonder what's going on,
Which can feel super painful because you think that you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, I can give you a really good example. at work, going through a couple of sort of restructurings, difficult times at work in the past. And, I had been involved in the process, and I had a chair next to my desk, and often colleagues would come and sit down in the chair and have a chat with me and get a bit of support. And the reason why I put a chair there was because colleagues were coming over to my desk and they were standing there having a chat, and I felt bad that they couldn't sit down. So I thought, let me put a chair. That will be helpful for them, won't it? And do you know what? It was the worst thing I could have ever possibly have done, because what started off as a well-meaning thing, let me help these people, let me give them a chair, so that I created a monster for myself, because it was an inappropriate lack of boundaries, in the sense that suddenly I realized, wow, maybe I'm getting more out of this than they are. Maybe I like being liked. Maybe I like people coming to me for advice. Maybe I like, maybe it's nice for me to feel connected to people. And I realized through my own process of counseling training at that time, wow, I'm also taking away their agency to manage their own problems.
Ooh, yeah.
And there is a real fine line between I'm supporting you to I am now taking away your agency. So for me, going through that process, reflecting on it myself, suddenly I had that thing like, oh shit, should I get rid of the chair? And then of course the brain was like, yeah, well, if you get rid of the chair, people think you're really rude. People think you don't want them to be welcome at your desk. People think that you're not being very helpful. I thought, oh shit, I'm gonna have to really, And do you know what? I got rid of the chair. It was never a problem. It was never a problem. And you know what? That to me was a really good example of self-reflection that was painful, that came from a point of, yeah, but surely I'm only helping people, to, oh, wow, actually this boundary is not strong as it needs to be for them and for me. And that's why, that's actually how I kind of started off on this journey of moving from somebody who likes to work with people and support them to somebody who can coach people, which is a very different way of working. Yeah.
Well, and the thing, you can clean this up for me if I don't define this right. But the biggest thing for coaching is to make sure that the person understands how powerful they are on their own. That accountability there is there. That keeping them responsible for their own things, but realizing that they are capable of all these things, and they have the power to make change, and helping people realize that they have that, and that they're not helpless, that they're not stuck, that they're not in a place where they can't create something new. That is one of the most beneficial things about coaching, it seems like.
Absolutely. I think it's the ability to be able to hold space and to support somebody in that space, which is slightly different from helping people in the broadest sense. And it really is that ability to support, but you're not there to fix everybody's problems. And going right back to the beginning, that's really hard when you work in a profession which is entirely about helping other people.
Yeah.
But being able to have that space and to be able to talk freely without being judged in and I think sometimes people are too sort of black and white. They sort of say, oh, well, well, if I'm not like this, then people will think I'm really unapproachable and that I'm not warm and helpful. And it's like, yeah, it's not one or the other. You can be an amazing coach, and you can be warm, and you can be non-judgmental, and you can be supportive and hold space, but you have the boundaries in place for the client to do the work and for the client to have that agency. So yeah, it's not easy, but because we all want to help each other. That's broadly the human experience, but it's not always helpful.
No. Kat, if there is anything that you recommend to other people, probably books, certain influencers, there's definitely influencers that I look at, but also like habits and actions that people can take from this episode, from the podcast, that you would recommend. What are the biggest things that stick out to you?
Genuinely, I feel that there is a massive benefit for people to be engaged in therapy or counseling. Whether or not they're also in a coaching process. I think that having that space where you are able to reflect on the patterns that have formed through life, the impacts of culture on your relationships, etc., is really important. But understanding that's not always possible or desirable for people. I think anything that can lead to some good self-reflection and focus energy on connecting mind and body through self-care is really good. So there's a fantastic book by Tracy Cleantis. It's called Invitation to Self-Care. And she does a very good description of all the different types of self-care and why some are more effective and more positive than others, and what it is about these different actions that are helpful or not so helpful. I think in terms of the real practical stuff, I think you're familiar with this book, Atomic Habits by James Clear, in terms of how can I start to shift then my thinking into behavior and action that works for me. I particularly like his tip about, make it easier to do the thing that you want to do and harder to do the thing that you don't want to do. So, for example, it sounds really weird, but you might say, I really got to get it off, like my phone, like I'm spending too much time on social media. It's really not helpful for me. So one simple thing is, if you're particularly lazy, leave your phone upstairs. And chances are you'll feel so lazy that you won't be bothered to go and get it. And suddenly
yeah,
silly things like that. But really, it's about changing that behavior. Sort of big books, like I said, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. I know this is one of your favorites. It's the Simon Sinek Start With Why.
So good.
How great leaders inspire everyone to take action. It really is about that reconnection back into yourself, and then to see where you can slowly, through what I call this process of recalibration, make small changes, because the power of small change is power indeed. That's what I say.
No, thank you for all of that, Kat. One last major question. Defined by you, what and your angle, what does it mean to be rebel-minded?
Yeah. Oh, it's a tricky one. It's a tricky one. But I think if I'm coming from the point of view of the big picture, the global zoom out and where I am in the world, I think really right now it's not, everything that's going on in the world, like I said, living in this unequal world with privilege and discrimination. Now to be rebel-minded is to say, I'm not going to accept this. And that may undermine everything I've said about how it's important not to get that, mindset. But I think genuinely, with the caveat that, you put in good boundaries and you take time for self-care, it really is just to say, I just don't accept that we live in a world where people, suffer. If you think about it, again, with the big picture, the blip in time that we're at, it's just unacceptable. With the things that we can do, with the resources and the technology that we have, and yet, and I think to be rebel-minded means to say, yeah, I just don't accept that.
Boom. Take action then.
Yeah, absolutely.
But also be balanced.
Yes.
Okay, Kat. So where is the best place for everybody to find you?
Yes. I am on social media. You can find me on Instagram at Little Green Guru, because I love my green space. That's a whole different podcast.
I love your green space.
Yeah. Oh, that time outside, it's great. And also I have a website, which is www.catalystcat.co.uk. And there's a load of information on there about what I do, why I do it, and how I can work with you. So if you like pictures of cats, food, garden, self-care, that's Instagram. If you want to read a bit more about my background and what I do and why I do it, that's the website.
Perfect. Okay, everybody. So you've heard from Cat Simmons today. She is fantastic. Thank you for being on here, Cat. I highly appreciate it. I will put all of her information in the episode. And if you're curious about this angle of self-care and, getting away from so much selflessness that it takes away from yourself, I implore you to reach out to her, because she's one of the most intelligent, wise people I've come across. Thank you, everybody, here for joining us on another episode of the Rebel Mind podcast. Stay strong and stay rebel minded. I'm your host, out. Here we are again at the end. I'm starting to tear up a little bit. And I just want you to know that I'm going to miss you. And I appreciate you. And I love you. And I hope that whatever you're after, you keep fighting for it. Your experience is uniquely your own. And so that means so are the challenges that you face. Stay strong and don't let anyone diminish who you are or what you dream of being. As your friend and fellow flawed human, stay rebel-minded, my friends. Until next time.